Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, everybody. Happy New Year and welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. As you've probably noticed, if you subscribe to the podcast, I haven't been podcasting or working on the radio or actually doing anything for almost 2 weeks. And it's been wonderful. Today I'm in the nation's capital, so if you are listening to the radio program, you will not hear me. There'll be somebody filling in for me because I'm not returning to Denver until tomorrow, the 7th. But anyway, I wanted to get this podcast in, and there's obviously a podcast will be a podcast for Tuesday also. But I wanted to talk a little bit for two things before I get to the subject at hand, which is this decision by a Denver court judge. Denver County Court. What's this judge's name? Johnny Barajas, B-A-R-A-J-A-S. Barajas? I don't know. Anyway, he's the one that issued the opinion ruling that Denver's camping ban was unconstitutional. And I want to walk through that because if you've heard the news over the holidays, the only thing that you've probably heard is that this judge ruled the camping ban unconstitutional. I've read the decision. It's a fairly short decision. I think it's about 9-10 pages long. But it's a fascinating decision simply because the judge is looking. He is absolutely looking for a way to find this ordinance unconstitutional. So we're going to walk through that decision in a minute, and I'm going to show you how activist judges work based on this decision. It's at least for me as a lawyer, it's fascinating, and I think for you, it will help you understand a situation where judges try to find, because of either their own biases or because of what they've read in the newspapers or seen on television, they want to find something unconstitutional. So they look for ways to do it. In this case, he found what I think is a really stupid way to declare it unconstitutional. But we'll get to that in a second. What I want to talk about, two things I want to talk about before I get to that. One is what I've done for the past 2 weeks. It's not fancy. We didn't go to Europe. We didn't go to South America. We didn't go to Africa. You know what we did? We didn't even go to the undisclosed location. We tuned out. We didn't engage. Well, we engaged with friends, but very little, if any, news whatsoever. I couldn't tell you the last time I've had Fox News on. I've not tweeted. I've not, for those of you that are on the Facebook page, at Michael D. Brown and the Michael Brown Unplugged podcast page, I haven't really engaged there either. So it was a 2-week period where we just didn't do the things that we normally do. Oh, we went to see movies. We went to see Richard Jewell. If you have not seen Richard Jewell, the movie by Clint Eastwood about the guy at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics that discovered the bomb, the satchel, the backpack that had the bomb, originally a hero for about 2 or 3 days, and then he became the villain. The movie itself was pretty good. I wouldn't call it Clint Eastwood's best movie, but it's a movie you need to go see. And you need to go see it because I've never been, and maybe this is because of my experiences with the media, I've never been more angry watching a movie than I was watching this movie. You know that kind of anger where your stomach gets in knots and you just want to scream out. You want to talk to the villains on the big screen. That's what I was doing for the hour, 45 minutes, whatever length this movie was. Eastwood did a fantastic job that I think are a couple of things that are important. First is how the media just absolutely doesn't care about the truth. And then how, you've heard me talk on the radio how, for example, the Associated Press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, one of the big newspapers, one of the big news outlets will break a story. Then in fact, for that matter, even CNN or Fox News, they'll break a story. They won't necessarily have all of their ducks in a row about that story. But then what happens is, and you have to watch this very, very carefully, is the other news outlets will jump on that story, but they won't do independent reporting. They will do things like, let's pretend that I am Bill Hemmer on Fox News. Bill Hemmer will come on and he will talk about a story this way. CNN is reporting that. The Washington Post is reporting that. The New York Times is reporting that. And then he'll go on to say exactly what it is that the New York Times, the Washington Post, or CNN are reporting. And then he may or may not add at the end that Fox News has not been able to independently corroborate whatever that story is. But what they have done in doing that is they have gotten that story out to the public without doing anything on their part. It's almost as if somebody had sent them a press release and they just read the press release. It's a big circle. It's a big circle jerk, but I'll try to be nice in the new year. No, that's not going to last very long. But that's what it is. It is just this never-ending, let's report on what somebody else reported and let's not do any independent fact-checking ourselves. And they destroyed, at least for 88 days, they destroyed Richard Jewell's and his mother's life. It was awful. And while I'm at it, let me pick on the FBI too. Now, as I watched, of course, I got mad at the FBI, but I kept thinking, okay, but is what they're doing legal or illegal? And I think in some cases, what they were doing to try to trap Richard Jewell into either making a confession, giving them information before he had a lawyer, at least in my opinion, verged on being unethical for law enforcement, or in this case, these guys who had law degrees, really walked right up to the edge of being something that you could file a bar complaint about. It's also a great lesson in, I don't care. Richard Jewell, bless his heart, I don't think he was the brightest bulb in the world. I think he truly believed that, well, I'm innocent. I have nothing to hide. So I'll just cooperate with these guys because I want to be a cop too. So I'll just talk to them all the time. And he talked to them before he finally reached out to a lawyer that he knew previously that had worked at the Small Business Administration. He finally reached out to this other lawyer who finally, in sometimes failed attempts to get Richard Jewell to shut up and quit talking. But if you watch the movie, and I truly encourage you to go watch this movie, one, you'll recognize just how awful the media was. And if you think the media was bad in 1996, imagine how bad they are today. It's not gotten any better. It's actually gotten worse. That's the first thing you need to do to go watch this movie. The second thing is, if I've told you once, I've said 1,000 times, don't talk to law enforcement. Don't say a word. I don't care if you're as innocent as Mother Teresa. You have a constitutional right to remain silent, and you should exercise that because, for example, in the case of these FBI agents, they didn't follow the evidence. What they did was they found somebody that they thought was an easy target that fit a profile, so they tried to create the evidence to match what they had already believed. And any good cop, any good detective will tell you that's not how you conduct an investigation. What you do when you conduct an investigation is you search for the evidence and you let the evidence lead you to the conclusion, not the other way around. But I want to emphasize, watch the movie for the media, watch the movie for never talk to cops, because they are not your friends. I don't care how innocent you are. And this is not saying that cops are bad cops. Now, in this case, I do believe that a couple of FBI agents were unethical in what they did. I can't say it was illegal. I just think it was unethical. They were using very aggressive police tactics, trying to get evidence to support the conclusion they had already come to. And remember, Richard Jewell thought he knew he was innocent, so I have nothing to hide. Go watch the movie for that reason. So that's one of the things that we did as we tuned out and didn't really engage in Twitter, Facebook, watch the news, or anything else. We just had a lot of good times with our granddaughter and our kids. Had a great Christmas, had a good New Year. We actually didn't go out on. Well, I take that back. We did go out on New Year's Eve, but for lunch, not dinner. Yeah, old fart. Make your jokes. I don't care. But here's what I found. It changes your perspective. You don't need to tune out for 2 weeks. But just like sometimes I know people who, for example, do intermittent fasting. I'm not one of them. Hell's bells, look at me. I know people that do intermittent fasting. I'm now a big believer that you ought to do intermittent tuning out. Maybe it's a weekend. Maybe you just take a weekend and you say, you know what, instead of watching any television, we're going to go to the movies, we're going to go eat out, we're going to go hiking, we're going to go for a road trip, we're going to do something. But I think getting away from this incessant, absolutely incessant coverage of the most mundane things is really destroying your minds. When I finally tuned back in, which I guess must have been Sunday. Yeah, it was Sunday afternoon. The stories that the local news channels were covering. Now, I understand it's a slow news day. And I understand the editor's thinking in why they choose to cover some stories because they have some, human interest side to it. But one of the big stories was that somebody that was out at the medical center at Anschutz had used valet parking and their car had been stolen. And I thought to myself, well, cars get stolen every day. And I know that sometimes people steal cars and, they have grandpa's ashes in an urn in the back seat or, there's some medical equipment in the back seat. I mean, I get that. But when you watch it, after having not watched it, you realize just how inane a lot of the news coverage is, local and national both. So I want you to make a resolution. I know I hate to use that term at the beginning of the year, but I want you to just start trying to intermittently check out, get out of that news bubble, get away from it, because it will, first of all, it refreshes your mind. It makes you think about what's important, which is, yourself, your family, your friends. It makes you reconnect with the real world. And I'm telling you, what's on that television is not the real world. Oh, I know they report on things that are actually going on, blah, blah, blah. I get all of that. But if that is all you consume, I guess the old adage of, you are what you eat. Well, you are what you consume if all you do is watch cable news, or for that matter, local news, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Tune out. That's my advice. The second thing I wanted to talk about before I get to the court case. As I've told you, we started a rebranding process. And that's been going on with a group that you hear me talk about at the end of the podcast called Whole Crowd. Whole Crowd is a company that some friends of mine own. I don't know everybody that works in the company, but some of the top people are good friends of mine. And we're going through a rebranding process. Now, there's going to be a new website going up, and I hope probably not this week, but sometime next week. The name of the radio program is changing. We're trying to figure out how to change the name of the podcast without breaking the RSS feeds where you automatically get it when you subscribe. But the new branding is The Situation with Michael Brown. The Situation with Michael Brown. And we went through this elaborate process of them grilling me and me having to fill out questionnaires and talk to friends and family about what it is that I like to do. And of course, what I like to do is I like to talk. I like to give speeches, which they're now acting as my agent for my speaking engagements. I like to give interviews on TV, whether it's Fox News or CNN, MSNBC. I don't care who it is. I like to do the podcast. I like to talk on the radio. What I like to do is, for example, what I'm about to do here. I'm about to take a case, a story that you've heard in the news, and break it down. I like to take these situations. I like to take stories that are maybe not in the news, but stories that I'm aware of. We're going to talk about things like homeland security issues, talk about personal security issues. We're going to talk about situations, whether it just be general everyday living that you may not think about, but suddenly you find yourself in, and how do you deal with those situations? So the new branding for everything that I'm doing is the situation with Michael Brown. So I hope you'll follow along as we start this new journey in this new year. You'll see the new website, obviously, on the podcast. I'll tell you when the new website is up. I'll be blogging on the website. Yep, we're going back to old-fashioned blogging. Just short, maybe 250, 350 words about something that I've seen, noticed, or I think that you might be interested in. And I'll give you a short snippet about, well, here's the situation, and here's what you ought to think about it. Not necessarily every time what you ought to think about it. Here's different ways to think about it. The situation with Michael Brown. So let's get to the story that I wanted to talk about. I've rambled on too long here, so let's get straight to this story. This story arises out of a guy by the name of Jerry Burton, who was a homeless person in Denver, who the cops went up to. And I want you to understand something about the facts. The facts of the case are this guy was homeless. Now, I don't know why. And I don't care. I don't mean I don't care in the sense that I'm cold-hearted. It's irrelevant to the facts. It's irrelevant to the case as to why he was homeless. Suffice it to say he was homeless. So they found this guy camping on April 29, 2019, on public property near 29th Street and Arkins Court, which is near the North Platte River in Denver. Now, when the cops came up to him, they gave him the option of going to a homeless shelter because that's what the ordinance requires. That's what the Denver camping ban requires. It requires that cops who encounter homeless people to first give them the option of going to a homeless shelter. It's only if they refuse that they can then be cited for violating the camping ban. And even before they can be cited for violating the camping ban, not only do they have to give them the option of going to a homeless shelter, but they either have to, the cops do, they have to find or contact a homeless advocate, a social worker of some sort, to come out and help them make an analysis of whether this individual that they have encountered is mentally ill, on drugs, on alcohol, although I don't know what the difference between drugs and alcohol is. Isn't it fascinating how we always talk about drugs and alcohol? Well, alcohol is a drug. Drugs include alcohol, but we always separate the two. Yeah, I'm on a tangent already. They come up to him. They give him the option of going to a homeless shelter. He refuses. So he was cited with violating the ordinance on the camping ban. But here's what's interesting. He was, in essence, given a ticket, something like a speeding ticket. He was issued a citation, but he was not arrested. And he wasn't arrested and taken to jail because he voluntarily took down his camp, put his tent and his belongings on a flatbed truck, and he and the flatbed truck drove away. Now, you and I know what happened. They drove him away to another part of town, took him to an alley somewhere. Now, I don't know this for a fact. I'm just surmising this. He put his stuff on the flatbed truck, and the driver took him to someplace else, away from the cops, and he unpacked his stuff, and he put his tent back up, and he went back to camping, because that's what homeless people are going to do. But I think it's important for you, in understanding how this judge was looking for a reason to find the ordinance unconstitutional, it's important to remember that he was not arrested. In other words, he was not put in handcuffs. He was not put in a patrol car. He was not taken to a police substation. He was not taken to the Denver City and County Jail. He was not arrested. He was given a ticket. A ticket. That's all. So how did the court find that the ordinance against camping on public property, where it's not permitted, is unconstitutional? Well, the judge goes through this whole litany of of things that the ordinance requires. And I think I've pretty much given you that. You can't camp on public property except where it's been expressly permitted. The officer, if the officer encounters somebody that they believe is violating the camping ban, they have to orally request or order the person to refrain from the violation. In other words, you got to give them a warning first. Hey, you shouldn't be camping here. I don't want to give you a ticket, so I have to give you this warning. And then if the person doesn't comply with the warning, then the officer is to issue a written request. This is so funny. Is to issue a written request or order to the person warning that if they fail to comply, then they may be cited. So you have to give them a verbal warning if they don't do anything. Then you have to give them a written warning. And if they don't do anything, then you may think the next step is to arrest them. Oh, no. The officer must attempt to ascertain whether the person is in need of medical or human services assistance, including but not limited to mental health treatment, drug or alcohol rehabilitation, or homeless services assistance. The cop must make reasonable efforts to contact and obtain the assistance of a designated human service outreach worker. That person then has to come make an assessment about whether or not that person needs some sort of assistance. Now, in lieu of that, if the person being cited or arrested, in other words, the person has come, the social worker has come, they made a determination, no, not a drug and alcohol problem. You don't need homeless assistance. He's just camping here. Then and only then, if the person refuses to take down their camp, can they be cited or arrested. And the way I read the ordinance is it's kind of in the discretion of the cop. Now, if you give a cop a discretion, you cops out there that listen know, what are you going to do? Oh, you're probably just going to issue the warning. You might issue the ticket. But if you issue the ticket, that means you might have to show up at court if he contests the ticket. Now, most homeless people aren't going to contest the ticket because they probably aren't going to, they're going to lose it or throw it away and forget about it or whatever, and they're not going to show up. But you don't want to go through you as a cop, don't want to go through the hassle of all the paperwork. So you're probably not going to do anything. You're going to give the verbal warning. You're going to call for assistance. You're then going to give the letter warning, and then you're going to go away and probably just leave them alone. I think the exceptions to those instances, those kinds of facts, might be where a cop encounters somebody violating the camping ban, say on the 16th Street Mall, parked in front of the Starbucks door. I think at that point a cop might issue a citation and might actually arrest somebody just to get them out of the way of the retail establishment that they're blocking. So here's what this guy, whose name was Jerry Burton, and I'm not sure, based on the decision, who represented him. I'm assuming it's either a public defender or the ACLU. But they take it and they challenge the citation. Remember, he was not arrested. They challenged the citation. Now, the judge starts out by pointing out that, and all of you wannabe lawyers, remember this. When you challenge the constitutionality of a statute, a regulation, a policy, an ordinance, the general rule is that there is a presumption of constitutionality, so that the court has to start with the idea that the law that I'm looking at, I have to presume is constitutional. Then I have to start digging deeper to see if I can overcome that presumption of constitutionality. This is called a facial challenge to the constitutionality, in this case of an ordinance. You start with, on its face, the ordinance is constitutional. Then you have to raise, the defendant does, or the person challenging the constitutionality, they raise a facial challenge to the constitutionality. In essence, just saying, but judge, on its face, this is unconstitutional. That's where you then have to prove by clear and unequivocal evidence that on its face, without digging any deeper, just reading the plain language of the ordinance, it would be unconstitutional to anybody looking at it. Well, the judge found in this case that it was not facially unconstitutional. So he then looks at the 14th Amendment. The defendant, this Jerry Burton, was arguing that it violated the 14th Amendment because the purpose of the ordinance was to harm a politically unpopular group. And they argued that the Denver Police Department was engaging in selective enforcement. Now, when I read this, the first thing I thought, how does this ordinance discriminate against homeless people? Because the ordinance applies to anybody. If you and I decide to go downtown Denver and set up camp on public property at the same location this guy did, the cops have to do the same thing to us that they do to a homeless person. And we're not homeless. So the idea that this ordinance is somehow targeting homeless people doesn't stand the test, because persons, whether they're homeless or not homeless, are going to be treated the same. The court then, well, I shouldn't say the court, the defendant then tried to argue that the ordinance was violating a protected class. And, a protected class is basically, race, gender, religion, national origin. I think sexual orientation is about to become a protected class. And the judge found, again, now remember, he found this unconstitutional, but he's going through all of these, what you would think would be the most important constitutional issues. And even on the subject of suspect classification, in other words, targeting a historically class of people that have been subject to discrimination, even on the basis of that, the judge said, nope, don't find it. In fact, he said that based on the testimony this court heard, the court finds that homeless have historically been subjected to discrimination, that the homeless have a transitory trait that is highly visible, that given their lack of income and a lack of a permanent shelter, they have been disadvantaged historically. A significant barrier to their participation in the political process is that very few of them are registered to vote. But then he said, the problem, though, is I cannot find that the homeless lack effective representation in the political process. He then went on to talk about how, the city council in Denver held public hearings, that there were people there. There's all these different coalitions and associations and groups that represent homeless people, that represent homeless as a class. And he was like, maybe they're not registered to vote, but they're certainly engaged in the political process through all of these proxies. So I cannot find that they are a discriminated class. Then the next argument that the defendant made was that the ordinance violates his right to bodily integrity. Yeah, that's a pregnant pause. How does a camping ban violate someone's right to bodily integrity? The judge said that the defendant argues that the danger of not using blankets, tents, and other items to shelter compromises health. But the court says, after hearing testimony, the defendant was not arrested, was allowed to load his possessions on a flatbed truck, and given this, the defendant's bodily integrity was not compromised. So the judge threw that out. So far he's thrown out all of the 14th Amendment arguments. He's thrown out the discrimination arguments. He's thrown out the right to bodily integrity argument. He gets to the right of privacy argument. And here he says that thus a man's home is, for most purposes, a place where he expects privacy. But objects, activities, and statements that he exposes to the plain view of outsiders are not protected under any privacy rules. Let me give you an example. What I say and do in my home is protected by privacy. But if I go stand out in my driveway and I start shouting at something, just yelling, there's no expectation of privacy. I'm still on my own private property, but I've given up my expectation of privacy when I stepped outside and started yelling. In this case, the homeless person is not on private property. The homeless person now, there are other ordinances dealing with camping on private property. That would be trespass. That might be public nuisance. We're talking about the camping ban on public property. And the court found that you don't have a right of privacy, despite what the liberal Ninth Circuit has said in other decisions, that you don't have this right of privacy because you're on public property and you have your belongings out in the open many times. So the judge dismissed the privacy claim of this defendant. So all of the constitutional claims so far have been thrown out. But just from reading the news and from what I told you ahead of time, this judge, I believe, was determined to find some reason to find this ordinance unconstitutional. And he did so, finding that it violated the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. I know. I don't get it. The Eighth Amendment says, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. In other words, there's a constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishments. That's the basis on which the court found this ordinance to be unconstitutional. Cruel and unusual punishment. When it gets to the Eighth Amendment, this court relied on a case out of Idaho, Martin versus City of Boise. It's a 2019 case. The court, on the other hand, in that case, distinguished those individuals from the city's homeless who could not access open beds. The judge says that this case ruled that if a homeless individual is denied entry to a shelter, then, quote, as a practical matter, no shelter is available. The judge says, in the matter at hand, this court heard testimony that there has been no shortage of homeless shelters in Denver since January 1 of 2018, that shelters in Denver operate well below capacity on a nightly basis. But on the other hand, the court said, I heard testimony that if every single homeless person in Denver attempted to access shelter, they could not do so under the current infrastructure. So the court says, I also heard testimony that men with children, individuals with serious mental illness, persons banned from shelters, unaccompanied, stop and think about that for a moment. A person that's banned from a shelter. They've engaged in violence, they've engaged in drug abuse, they've engaged in the selling of drugs, they've sexually assaulted somebody. Those people should be banned from shelters. But the court says, I heard testimony that men with children, individuals with serious mental illness, persons banned from shelters, unaccompanied homeless youth, individuals with pets, LGBT individuals, and same-sex partners have limited access to adequate shelter. He says the court also heard testimony that unless accompanied by a Denver police officer, persons who have swing shift jobs and other persons who seek shelter after curfew are turned away because of shelter curfews. So he says that on the face of it, that violates the Eighth Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment. I don't get it. I honestly don't get it. He says, and this is the conclusion, based on the foregoing, the ordinance facially violates the Eighth Amendment and Article 2, Section 20. Quote, as long as there is no option of sleeping indoors, the government cannot criminalize indigent, homeless people for sleeping outdoors on public property on the false premise they had a choice in the matter. Defendant's motion to dismiss is granted. He ruled it unconstitutional, cruel and unusual punishment. I want you to think about it for a moment, because he's saying that because after going through all of the things cops have to go through, you You encounter somebody that's homeless. You give them a warning. Then you tell them you're going to give them a warning. Then you have to call a social worker or a homeless advocate. Then you have to give them the option of moving somewhere else or getting up, packing their stuff up and leaving. And only if they refuse to do any of those things, you still have the option of giving them a ticket or arresting them. Now, I think a good cop, let's say it's a bitterly cold night, and the homeless person, they've gone through all of that process, they arrest the person. Why do you think they arrest the person? Because that cop is trying to get the person out of the deadly cold temperatures. Arrest them, take them to a police substation, have them sit there while they're getting processed, maybe even put them in a holding cell for a while. At least they're out of the elements. At least they're out of the cold. Let's take summertime. Summertime when it's, actually quite pleasant at night. 2 o'clock in the morning in Denver, no humidity, gorgeous summer evening. Perfect night to go sleep out in your hammock. Homeless people are not suffering in the summertime. I don't get cruel and unusual punishment. I think this is a great example of a judge being an activist judge, rationalizing that this is cruel and unusual punishment because somebody might get arrested. Remember, this person wasn't. The facts of this case, this person was not arrested. This person voluntarily packed his stuff up, went somewhere else, didn't even get a ticket. Yet the judge finds, the ordinance, cruel and unusual punishment. An activist judge. I think that's the rest of the story that the news outlets in Denver and Colorado are not going to give you. So thanks for joining me today. Glad to have you back. It's good to be back. Be sure and drop me a line if you'd like to comment about this ban on homelessness, or for that matter, if you'd like to comment on me checking out for a couple of weeks or the Richard Jewell film movie. Be sure and go to that. If you want to comment about any of that, feel free to do so. You can always find me on Twitter at Michael Brown USA. You can find me on Facebook, Michael D. Brown. And remember, on the Facebook page at Michael D. Brown, we have a separate page. You can follow the show at Michael Brown Unplugged on the Facebook page. Now, if you haven't already, don't forget, subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Spreaker, Google Podcasts. Quite frankly, just subscribe to it wherever you're listening to it right now. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, I really would appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating and a positive review. Michael Brown Unplugged, soon to be The Situation with Michael Brown, is written by me and produced by Right Turn Media. My marketing and social media is done by Whole Crowd. Thanks again for listening. Talk to you tomorrow.